Hi, good evening from Israel. Tonight, again, it's me on my own. We're going to be talking a little bit about Gaza and the regional ramifications for what's going on. And the question that I think first needs to be asked, and the fact that nothing really seems to be changing week by week, is what we do see in the background: major diplomatic shifts and major restructuring of alliances in the Middle East. And what we now have to ask ourselves is Gaza becoming the new battleground for power struggle in the Middle East between long-standing rivals, perhaps new rivalries? If we look back to October 7th, 2023, one of the main reasons we now know, and we kind of suspected at the time, for the invasion, for the massacre, was to stop Israel's very, very possible and probable and very likely normalization with Saudi Arabia. As we know, Israel had already normalized relations with 4 Arab countries: UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. And we know that none of this could have happened without Saudi say so. And they were always a player behind the scenes, a positive player. And the question was, when would Saudi Arabia join the Abraham Accords? When would the most important country in the Muslim and the Arab world make peace with Israel, normalize relations with Israel? And that was really the big prize, and that was the big moment, and perhaps, structurally speaking, the end of the Arab-Israel conflict once and for all. Not the Israeli-Palestine conflict, but perhaps, a real earthquake in the region, positive earthquake. And this was something the extremists, chiefly led by Islamic Republic of Iran, the Shiite axis, would have certainly been a massive blow for their regional aspirations. If we look at what was happening a month before October 7th, I believe it was September 9th, President Biden, then President Joe Biden, talked about an economic corridor that would run from India through the Middle East, through Saudi Arabia, through Israel, into Europe. This was a major challenge, not just to Shiite attempted hegemony in the Middle East, but also to China's Belt Road project, the idea of soft power emanating around the world, economic power, etc., etc. This was going to be a pivotal moment, not just for the Middle East, but far beyond, into Asia, into Europe. And we understood, even though Hamas, now we know, looking at Yahya Sinwar's intelligence cache that was found by the IDF, that October 7th had been planned for quite a while. One of the reasons that they couldn't wait any longer was because of the suspected, and probably would have happened, normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel. And what we have seen over the subsequent 2-year war is the Shiite axis has largely been dealt a massive blow, whether it's the Syrian regime, Bashar al-Assad, though himself not a Shiite, very much associated, connected, coordinated, and partnered with Iran, Hezbollah. We see, he's obviously gone from the scene. We see a very anti-Iranian president in al-Shara. We see Hezbollah dealt a heavy blow, even though they are trying to regroup, rearm, and there's certainly a concern that the Lebanese government is not doing enough to stop that, even though it has obligated itself to do so. But Hezbollah has definitely been dealt a heavy blow. Islamic Jihad and Hamas in Gaza have been dealt a very deadly blow. Again, we have to wait to see if they can regroup and they can rearm, something that they are attempting to do as we speak. We saw in Iran itself that, 12-day war, where Israel certainly dealt a very heavy blow to Iran, not just its ballistic program, but its nuclear program. The debate is on exactly how far back it's pushed and whether it can resurrect it, whether it can get back to even some sort of nuclear weapons program where it's 60% weapons grade uranium is, whether it's buried, whether it's destroyed, where it is, whose hands it is, and what they're doing with it. But it's clear that Iran and its Shiite axes, proxies around the region, were dealt a heavy blow over the last 2 years. But as we know, the region abhors a vacuum, and who have stepped into the breach a little bit is Qatar and Turkey. They're trying very much to claim a certain amount of power in the region. And what's most interesting about these two countries are they are very closely aligned to the Muslim Brotherhood. For all those who don't know the Muslim Brotherhood, they're quite an old extremist organization in the Middle East. They're involved in many different aspects, whether it's extremist beliefs, but the groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and certainly Hamas have come out of the Muslim Brotherhood. And in fact, Hamas is the Palestinian chapter of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's a very dangerous and extremist organization, one that, to a certain extent, the Erdogan regime in Turkey has modeled itself on, one that finds a relatively happy home in Qatar. But let's not forget that is not something which is entertained by other major players in the region. Muslim Brotherhood is actually banned in many countries, like Egypt, like Jordan. It's certainly no friend of the Saudi regime and others. So what we are seeing is really a return to what we were talking about 2 years ago, more than 2 years ago, before October 7th, that the region was no longer really, put into Israel and the rest of the Arab world, or the Shiite world and the Sunni world. We are now back to the point where we can divide the Middle East between extremists and moderates. And what we're seeing is the extremists led by Qatar, led by Turkey, are very much trying to get a foothold in Gaza. And we see the moderates led by Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, who certainly would be preferable, not just from Israel's point of view, but from most of the world's point of view, if they could get a foothold in Gaza. But at this point in time, neither Saudi Arabia and the UAE want to really put boots on the ground, understandably so, whereas Turkey certainly have offered, Qatar have offered money, but Turkey have offered boots on the ground. That for Israel is a non-starter. For a number of years, Israel has seen a growing antagonism. Antagonism is probably understating it. It's far more than that, certainly coming from the highest levels, President Erdogan himself. And we saw this week that they've tried to indict, I think it's 10 or 12 Israeli senior figures for genocide, war crimes, whatever it is. Again, a sign of Turkey's antagonism. But what we also should understand, that this is not just about Israel. It's not even just about Gaza. It's about hegemony in the region. For for centuries, there has been power struggles in the region, and we haven't seen the rise of Turkey since the end of the Ottoman Empire. A number of years ago, we did read, at that time, Foreign Minister Davutoglu's treatise on neo-Ottomanism and the idea that Turkey and Turkish power rise again. It will regain its hegemony that was lost at the end of World War I in the region, and President Erdogan and those around him, ideologues like Davutoglu, have certainly had their eyes on something greater from beyond its borders. We see its attempts to control Syria. We certainly see what it's trying to do in Iraq. Anywhere that Kurds are involved is obviously something very antagonistic to them. But what we also see is the danger for Turkey at least, of this, Asia, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, because it would bypass them. They're very worried about Israel's gas resources, sending it into Europe, going around them. All of these things are at play. And Qatar, we know, has played what Israel sees as a certainly problematic role in the region. But these are the two players at the moment who are stepping up and saying, we will take a role in the rehabilitation of Gaza. These are two countries which Israel is obviously most circumspect about. But as I said, it's not just about Israel at this point. It's certainly not even just about Gaza. It's about a power play, and it will be very important to see which of these sides will gain in the ascendancy. Next week is going to be an absolutely crucial meeting with this in mind. We see MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the leader of Saudi Arabia, going to meet President Trump in the White House. They're going to sign a defense pact. It's assumed it will be something similar to what was signed with Qatar. But most importantly, from Israel at least, is where do we stand on the subject of normalization? Now, it's clear that normalization will not be signed. There will be no grand declaration on ending, on creating diplomatic relations with Israel. That's certainly off the table at this point. But the question is, what can be achieved in this meeting? Could there be a path towards normalization? What would that look like? And what would be expected of Israel? Because it's clear that the Saudis have moved quite a lot on this. And I've talked about this, over the last few months, if not few years. Originally, Saudi Arabia said that they and the rest of the Arab world would never make peace with Israel until there's a Palestinian state. Over the years, that evolved from the early 2000s to a position where Palestinian state was barely mentioned. And in the lead up to October 7th, that's where we were. There would have been normalization with almost, I would say, no mention of Palestinian statehood or sovereignty. It was not really an issue at that point. It certainly wasn't an issue for any of the other four signatories to the Abraham Accords. And it's unlikely, and I can tell you from behind the scenes, it wasn't even a factor. October 7th changed all of that. And as I said, partly it was meant to. And there is a feeling from Saudi Arabia as they can't now, turn back the clock. And they have talked about the necessity of at least an irrevocable move towards Palestinian statehood. Now, perhaps, it's hard to say what that irrevocable step would be, but what we do know is that it's unlikely that will be, receive, receptive points of view, especially with this government. Perhaps if it was at least something vague, something that could be interpreted in different ways, that could be seen in a positive way. And that's certainly what the Trump administration is working on with MBS, with the Saudis, and also with Israel. What can be achieved, because it is very important for President Trump to have this normalization, to at least start moving towards it, because he feels this is part of the grand plan that takes into account the ceasefire in Gaza and peaceful moves around the region. This is something he very much wants to achieve. He understands that they can't go to the end line at this point of normalization, but what can be achieved. And it will be a crucial test of Israel's leadership, because it probably will mean swallowing a few things that this leadership and this government will not particularly like. Whether it won't be, a demand like President Obama for Prime Minister Netanyahu to get up and make a speech like he did at Bar-Ilan all those years ago, accepting the two-state solution. The Americans know, the Saudis know that that's not going to happen, but perhaps it can be something, which is, ambiguous, like, as we already saw in the 21-point plan, Trump's 21 point ceasefire plan for Gaza, where, if we remember, I think it was point 18 or 19, one of those towards the end, where it does mention Palestinian sovereignty and Palestinian statehood. Now, in Israel, they sort of brushed that off as, window dressing and not really relevant. There are so many other stages to go through that it just won't really, matter. Perhaps it can be something along those lines, but it will be very interesting and very important to hear what MBS and the Saudis say while they're in Washington, and to get a sense of then what will be expected of Israel. As I've said many times, almost everything that happens in Israel from this point onwards can be seen through the prism of politics, domestic politics, local politics. We are under a year now until the absolute maximum time to hold the next general election in Israel. And Prime Minister Netanyahu knows that it could be at any point over the next year. He would prefer it further down the line as possible. There are other issues he has to deal with, whether it's the ultra-Orthodox enlistment issue or trying to pass the budget. But also another thing that he has to watch out for is he can't be seen as being weak or accepting anything that even looks suspiciously like acceptance of Palestinian sovereignty at this point in time. So it'll be quite a balancing act, and it will be very interesting to see. Just another couple of points before we go to the questions. In Gaza, as I said, very little has changed. The yellow line has not moved. Hamas are pretty much controlling the western side, and Israel's controlling the eastern side. There are still 200 terrorists in Rafah. A few of them came out today and were shot dead. They tried to attack once again IDF troops and they were shot dead. The reason there's still 200 or 100, some say even as little as 60 terrorists in Rafah is because no third country has come along and agreed to take them. Israel and the US have agreed that they can leave as long as they lay down their arms and make some sort of declaratory promise of not returning to terrorism, but they need to go to a third country. At this point in time, that third country still has not come forward, so they still remain underground. The big drama of today was an official letter by US President Donald Trump calling on Israel's president, Bougie Herzog, to pardon Netanyahu for things that he hasn't even been, actually convicted of. So it's quite a bizarre thing to ask for a pardon for something he hasn't convicted. But it's part of what President Trump mentioned when he came to the Knesset, when he, in the middle of a speech, suddenly turned to President Herzog and asked for a pardon there on the plenum floor. And there was a promise in a 60-minute interview where he would take more steps to try and relieve Prime Minister Netanyahu of the legal challenges that he faces. This certainly is a good playing ground for Prime Minister Netanyahu to have the most powerful man on the planet on his side, someone who's very popular in Israel, someone who's credited with achieving a ceasefire, achieving the return of the hostages. And this is certainly something which Netanyahu would welcome, and it also changes the narrative to a certain extent around, as I said, his legal challenges. One more interesting element that happened today is the resignation of Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer. We've talked about Ron Dermer quite a lot and how he's not really a classic minister. He's more a senior advisor to Netanyahu. Some call him Bibi's brain. He is probably the closest thing to Netanyahu, especially on the diplomatic level. He is the man most trusted by Netanyahu, especially when it comes to America. And he's been at the center of all major events over the last 2 years, negotiating with the US, the hostage deal, everything. He has been the man who Netanyahu has sent to act in his stead. He's quit. It's not a great surprise. Ron Dermer is a consummate diplomat. He's a consummate negotiator, interlocutor, but he's not necessarily a politician. According to reports, and I'm sure that there's some truth to it, he was offered a secure spot in the next Likud list for the next elections, but he turned that down. He's not someone I think really built for the the sort of to a certain extent level of politics in Israel, the things that has to be done, the rough and tumble of it. And it's no great shock that at this point, when the hostage deal, the hostages are home, and we look like we're going to phase 2 at some point of the ceasefire deal, that he is officially quitting his position. What is clear is he'll still be involved, he'll still be around, and many observers have basically say he will take something akin to Steve Witkoff's role with President Trump. He'll be his advisor for issues where he can get involved in a less than official capacity, not necessarily with a government title, but whenever Netanyahu needs him, he will be there sorting out whatever needs to be dealt with. But much of the file that he's been dealing with the US over the last couple of years will be handed over to Ambassador Yechiel Leiter in Washington. So there is a little bit of a shuffle there. As I said, Dermer will be still there in the background and handy and ready whenever he gets that call. And with that, I'm going to open the chat and see what questions there are. Let's see. What is Israel doing to secure the release of the remaining 4 hostages? Well, at the moment, it's we are down to the last 4, I believe, 1 foreign national and 3 Israelis. They're waiting. They're pushing the Americans to push whoever needs to be pushed, whether it's the Qataris, whether it's Hamas directly, to release the last 4. That's expected. Israel certainly won't consider stage 1, phase 1, at an end until every single hostage has been released, Israeli or foreign. And there seems to be this week we did get a few hostages released, including Hadar Goldin, which has been pretty much, his body has been held for 11 years, and that was certainly one which had a great emotional resonance in Israel because of this long-standing story, because that he was held as a bargaining chip for so long, and the fact that his parents were now, after 11 years, able to bury him. That was a significant moment, and I'm sure that was all related to what's going on the ground with potentially those 200 terrorists hiding in Rafah and some of the other things, because it's understood the emotional resonance that the return of Hadar Goldin had on the Israeli public. The final four are supposed to be released. That's the deal. That's what Hamas agreed to. And Israel is going to push that. Again, today, Israel allowed Hamas to wander around certain areas beyond the yellow line, ostensibly to look for these bodies. But at the moment, it doesn't seem that there's any pending hostage release coming in the next couple of days. Next question. Andy Palek asks, is settler violence running amok, or has it been blown out of proportion? To a certain extent, both of the parts of your question are correct. First of all, there is a certain sector, a very small sector, and I want to stress that again and again. We're not talking about more than a few dozen. It's terrible, and each and every one attack should be condemned and is being condemned. But there are certainly dozens of extremely violent Israelis who live over the Green Line, although we don't know exactly where they live, and sometimes these people come from within the Green Line, etc. But it's clear that there has been an uptick in violence against Palestinians and even the IDF in Judea and Samaria. It certainly is worrying. It should be dealt with, but let's not forget the army is stretched, and Judea and Samaria is a very large area, and it's very difficult to find, a few dozen. There were reports on TV that the amount of arrests in the last year done in Judea and Samaria against Israelis, against settlers, has gone down, but it should be condemned. It should be something dealt with by the authorities, but it also shouldn't be blown out of proportion to mean that 500,000 Israelis who live over the Green Line are all violent and engaged in this sort of thing. Is Stephen Gilbert asks, is Israel trapped in an American bear hug where it no longer has freedom to act in Gaza without prior US consent? Well, this is something definitely debated within Israel, exactly where a decision's made to do with Gaza, whether they're made in Jerusalem or in Washington, D.C. To a certain extent, yes, Israel has become extremely reliant on the US. Israel is actually most worried at this point about a potential US-led UN Security Council resolution to create this international force for Gaza, because that will tie Israel's hands even more, and it could give countries like Qatar and Turkey the way in or the way around Israel's basic no to their presence into Gaza. This is something that Israel is trying to influence the US on. But at the moment, the US is pretty much the decider of what goes on. If it was up to Israel, I'm sure they would not release these 200 terrorists under Rafah. But the Americans are really, really keen for this issue to be resolved. And they believe that the best way, which is their greater strategy, to keep the ceasefire intact is to let these people go, to perhaps, as Steve Witkoff said, use it as a paradigm for how Hamas can be disarmed, and those who accept an end to this war can then go into exile, and perhaps that could be the pathway towards the demilitarization of Gaza. Not a lot of people in Israel are buying that. Less and less people by the day believe that Gaza Strip will be demilitarized. Hamas will be disarmed. So exactly what are these international forces going to do? What is the US going to do? There is already talk of a track 2 if the original 21 Trump point plan for Gaza does not come about, because Hamas does not disarm. What happens next? What is Israel's leeway? What does the US do next? Apparently, these are plans being drawn up, not just in Jerusalem, but also in DC. At the moment, Israel is going along with the 21 points. They are waiting to see what happens. They don't believe that Hamas will disarm. They don't believe these 21 points will come to fruition. But they certainly don't want to go against Americans' wishes at this point. So, while not to say that there's necessarily a bear hug, but certainly there's a trepidation within Jerusalem to do anything that could disrupt Donald Trump's plans. I think we have time for one last question. Devi Eden said, I recently read that the US is establishing a large military base in the Negev. Good or bad? Well, this has come up over the last few days that there is going to be a very large base. I think 10,000 troops, maybe not just US, maybe other troops as well, is going to be built near Gaza, is I think how it's described. But I did read that a White House spokesperson basically said this was just an opinion paper, this is not policy, and at the moment there are no plans to do that. Israel has welcomed US troops onto its territory many times. Israel has always had a basic policy that they would not ask a single foreign national, certainly not in the US, to shed blood on its behalf. Israel fights its wars for itself, by itself. Yes, it gets American help like it did in Iran, or it certainly gets equipment to fight like it has done in Gaza and Lebanon and elsewhere. But I think it would certainly be unlikely and perhaps maybe not even overly popular, certainly with the decision makers, to create such a large US base in Israel. And at the moment, according to the White House, officially, it's not being countenanced. But again, we'll have to wait and see. The fact that it's been raised, at least at some level, means it is being considered, but it doesn't sound like it's moving forward at this moment. And with that, I think we've come to the end of this week's Israel Insider. I want to thank you all of those who joined us. Thank you for those who wrote questions. Sorry I'm not able to get to all of them. If some of them are relevant for next week, then please keep them in mind and please put them in the chat for next week. I'll say good night from Israel. Thank you, and please join me again next week. Thank you.